The next section we're going to dive into is some of this more common standard entry class codes, or SEC codes. We're going to talk a little bit about when those should be used, and then why is it so important to use the proper standard entry class code? We get that question all the time. Why do I have to use it? Why does it matter? Well, it matters because the rules say that the ODFI is warranting that every entry contains the proper information for processing, including the correct standard entry class code. So number one, it's in the rules. But number two, it's going to affect the returns and the return options that that receiver has should they want to dispute that transaction as unauthorized. And that's really important because there's a very big difference in the ability to return a consumer entry versus a non-consumer entry and the timing for that. So very important to use the proper standard entry class code. So as I just kind of alluded to, standard entry class code is generally going to be based on a receiver type, so consumer or non-consumer. And then for the consumers, it's further broken down into how that authorization was obtained. So non-consumers, we really only have a couple of choices. Consumers, we have quite a few, and we're going to break it down based on how did we get that authorization from our customer or the receiver. So first one we're going to talk about is PPD. This one's probably the most common that we're going to see as far as the number of entries. So PPD, pre-arranged payment and deposit entry. These are going from a non-consumer originator, so a business. They can be a debit or a credit, and they're going to a consumer receiver. So I gave examples of UMACHA sending me payroll, and I gave an example of the electric company sending me a debit for my electric bill. Both of those could be PPD entries. They're going from a non-consumer to a consumer, can be a debit or a credit. Frequency here, these can be single, recurring, or subsequent. So we could have just one single entry, or we could have recurring entries that happen at substantially regular intervals. Could also be subsequent, where I do something to trigger that additional payment. For that authorization, remember we talked about the method of authorization. For a debit, these are going to be written and then signed or similarly authenticated. Usually we think PPD, pen, right? P for pen. These are going to be written. I'm going to take a pen and I'm going to sign my name to it. Could be similarly authenticated, meaning maybe I'm logging into a system at your location and you're able to verify my identity that way. Or I print a form out and I bring it into the location. You're somehow verifying my identity with that similar authentication. But for the most part, these are written and signed with a wet signature on a piece of paper. For credits, credits are a little bit different. So here we say the authorization just needs to be legally obtained. So UMACHA did have me fill out a form, and I believe I probably signed it to give them authorization to credit my account for my payroll. However, they wouldn't have had to. As long as they obtained my authorization legally, they are good to go as far as a PPD credit. All right, couple other things to understand here. This kind of simplifies what I just said. So those direct deposits or credits, we're taking money and we're transferring it to a consumer receiver's account. So think about things like payroll, probably the most common, but could also be things like a pension or a government payment, right? Money is going from the non-consumer originator to the receiver. Direct payment or the debit is just the opposite. We're transferring funds out of that consumer receiver's account to pay that non-consumer originator. So utility payments, loan payments, bill pay, those sorts of things could use PPD as the standard entry class code. Next one we want to talk about here is TEL, or the telephone initiated entry. So now I hold the phone up to my ear with my hand, right, to show that this is a telephone call. So anytime I say TEL, I'm going to hold the phone up to my ear, right, the fake phone at my hand, and say this is a telephone initiated entry, meaning this is an authorization that is provided via a telephone call. Super important to understand. We're not going to go super deep into all of the details, but just know that when you are using TEL, you have some additional requirements. You have to have an existing relationship, or the receiver needs to initiate that phone call, but they're calling you on the phone. So that's different than something that's authorized online, say a voice call or a video chat. These can also be single, recurring, or subsequent, so similar to what we saw over on the PPD. These are always going to be a debit with exception for maybe a reversal. You wouldn't generally see a credit in the TEL network or in the TEL world. So non-consumer originator, so you as a business, debiting a consumer that either called you or had a phone call and you have an existing relationship. And I saw a question come in about PDF of the screens. If you go to the materials section of your GoToWebinar control panel, you should see the slides there. And as I say that, let me look to make sure I really did get them there, and I did. So you should see them there. We'll also provide them after the session as well. So you'll have those slides that you can follow along with the recording, or you can share with other folks on your team. Okay, web debits. So web standard entry class code is going to be used for internet or initiated mobile entries on the debit side. The credits are different. So when we think about web, we're talking about debit. So we talk about web debits are communicated via the internet or a wireless network. So if you have customers or clients that log in to a web portal or they use a mobile app, somehow that authorization for the entry is obtained and communicated to you over the internet or a wireless network, those entries should be a web debit. So we want to specify that these entries were obtained, the authorization was obtained over the internet. So that's a little bit different than someone coming in and signing a piece of paper at your location, for example. So these are still going to be from a non-consumer originator, so your company, to a consumer receiver. So example, if I log into the electric company's web portal and I authorize my payment through there, they're likely going to use a web debit through the ACH network to collect the funds that I've authorized them to pay my bill. Some other things we need to know about web debits. So this top one is important to understand. If you are obtaining payments over the internet or wireless network, then you are a web debit originator. Even if you obtain one entry every other year, you're still a web debit originator. So we need to conduct or have conducted an annual audit of your systems to make sure that you're adequately protecting that information when it's within your environment. Meaning you're doing things like encryption or secure transmission of that data. You're not just having it sitting out there unsecured for anybody to access. The next one for a web debit originator, you've got to use some sort of commercially reasonable fraudulent detection system to screen those entries. And that needs to be done the first time you use an account number or anytime an account number is changed. So if you're a web debit originator and somebody wants to use a brand new account number or they want to change the account number, we've got to do some sort of fraud detection to make sure that that truly is an authorized change. Next up, originators need to use some sort of commercially reasonable procedures to verify the validity of that routing number, making sure it's a valid routing number. A lot of times you're using software or systems to help you create these files that likely have that built in regardless of the standard entry class code, but it is a requirement on web debits. And then last one, the originator needs to use some sort of commercially reasonable procedures to verify the identity of the receiver. How did you know that it was me that logged into that web portal and authorized that payment, right? Now you've seen the word commercially reasonable a couple of times here. And the NACHA rules use that language so that they don't have to be super prescriptive on exactly what does the originator need to do. It leaves it open. So if you are a small mom and pop originator, you have 2 employees, your commercially reasonable procedures are going to be very different than a large company that has thousands of employees, has complex systems, has network monitoring, all of those things. That's why we give you a little bit of flexibility here. Doing nothing will never, ever, ever be commercially reasonable. So don't think that you can do nothing. You have to do something, but what you do just needs to be commercially reasonable, meaning that somebody in a similar position would look at what you're doing and say, yeah, that seems logical. That seems reasonable. a reasonable choice to make in those circumstances or in that situation. So just understand there's some flexibility here. If you have questions about exactly what this means or what you can do specifically at your organization, I would encourage you to talk to the CCF Bank folks. They can likely give you some examples or some things that their systems may have built in or available to you. So that's a really great resource for you, is to reach out to your contacts over there at CCF Bank. All right, couple other things about web debits. So web debits are transferring funds out of a consumer receiver's account. So remember, we talked about utility payments, loan payments, those sort of things. Could also be funding a digital wallet, could be purchasing goods or services from an online retailer. But essentially what we're doing is we're taking funds from that consumer receiver and we're moving them to us as that non-consumer originator. All right, those were our consumer standard entry class codes. Notice we talked about debiting and crediting consumers in those last several slides. Now we're going to talk about the businesses. So this is CCD and CTX. They are very similar. We often lump them together. This is when we have a non-consumer originator. So you as a business, either debiting or crediting a non-consumer receiver. So another business. So for example, CCF Bank is a member of UMACHA, so they pay dues to UMACHA. So if we debited them for those dues, we would do a CCD entry because we're both businesses. So that's how we would be doing an entry between the two of us. Same with your business. If your business is sending an ACH entry to or from another business, you're going to use CCD or CTX. So frequency is going to be defined by the agreement between the two businesses. Our requirements here are very different than they are on the consumer side because we're not working with consumers. We don't have to think about consumer protections. We're looking at businesses that likely already have some sort of agreement between them. So as long as we are obtaining those debit authorizations in a legal manner and we're binding the receiver to the rules, it's good. Credits, very similar. We just have to make sure that we're legally obtaining all of that information and that authorization. So beyond that, it can be part of another agreement. It can be a form. There's not as big of requirements. There's not as many requirements as there are over on the consumer side. All right, so other things to know when it comes to CCD and CTX entries. So the first one talks about healthcare EFTs. So if you are a business that sends healthcare payments, then you would need to make sure that you're using some formatting requirements to provide some addenda information for those healthcare payments. On the receiving side, if you're receiving healthcare payments, you likely are getting payments with addenda information that has this required data to help you process those payments. All right, so this is where the difference lies between a CCD and a CTX. CCD entries can contain up to one addenda record. So think of an addenda record as like that memo line on your check, or if you put a sticky note on your check before you send it off into the envelope with that little bit of information. If we have one of those records, that could be a CCD entry. We don't have to have an addenda record, but we can have up to one. CTX entries allow for up to 9,999 addenda records. So think about 9,999 Post-it notes stuck to our payment to say, here's some information. So in practice, what this looks like is a business, let's say they're paying 10 invoices and they want to send one payment for the total of the 10 invoices. They could include 10 addenda records to say the different invoices that they're paying and the amounts of those invoices, the invoice numbers of those invoices. So the receiver knows how to apply the payment, but they're only getting one credit for that total amount. So that's where we would see this used in practice. All right, jumping down to that fourth bullet point here, CCD and CTX authorizations need to be readily identifiable as an authorization, need to have clear and readily understandable terms. But like we said, it could be part of another agreement. It could be part of a contract between the two businesses. But it does need to say, this is an ACH authorization. You need to be able to look at it, understand the terms of what's going on, and that it is truly an ACH authorization. Last bullet point here, CCD and CTX are the only standard entry class codes that should be used for originators by a non-consumer originator to the account of a non-consumer receiver. Meaning if you are paying or collecting money from another business, you should use CCD or CTX, end of story, regardless of how you got the authorization. And we'll talk about why that's important when we get to the returns section here in just a little bit. So if we're paying a business, as a business, always going to use either CCD or CTX. So again, this slide you've seen for the other standard entry class codes for the deposits or the credits. We're moving funds from our business to another business. For the payments or the debits, we are taking funds from another business and moving it to our business. So kind of seeing how those funds are moving. This slide just summarizes what we just went over. So we have our PPD, web, and tel. Those are our consumer receivers. So based on how that authorization was obtained, so written authorization for that PPD, online authorization for that web, that would include things like a FaceTime or a Skype or a Teams meeting, something along those lines where it's happening over the internet, even though it kind of looks like a phone call. Those are all going to be web because it's happening over the internet. And then tel is going to be those authorizations obtained over the telephone call. Remember, we're holding the phone up to our ear, telephone call, not necessarily things like a video chat or anything like that. Now you'll notice those first three, the last piece of it says extended returns allowed. So this means those consumer receivers can go and dispute those transactions with their financial institution, and you could receive a return for those entries as unauthorized for approximately 60 days after the settlement. So think about you as a consumer, take off your business hat, put on your consumer hat. If you have an unauthorized entry in your account, you're likely going to contact your financial institution. They're going to have you fill out a form and you're going to return that entry. That can happen on the entries that you originate as well. Think about the flip side of that, right? When you return an entry, originator is going to get that entry back. Well, when we put the business hat back on, now you're the business that is getting that return. So when we think about those CCD and CTX entries, they all fall under what we call the general return time frame, meaning extended returns are not allowed unless those CCD or CTX entries happen to go to a consumer account. What does this mean in practice? If you as a business send a PPD debit to another business and that business wants to dispute the transaction, they get to take advantage of that extended return time frame. So you could get that return back up to 60 days later, whereas if you use the CCD or a CTX, they would have about 2 days to make that return back to you. So big difference in what returns are allowed based on the account type and the standard entry class code. So that's another reason it's super important. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to returns here in just a couple of minutes.